A falcon never bows to power. It bows only to the hand that understands why it learned to fear. By noon, every noble guest at Blackwood Manor had gathered beneath the pale winter sky to witness the Duke's famous falcon return to the hunt, though no one said aloud that they had come less for sport than for spectacle. Ashwing had not flown before an audience in nearly 3 years, not since the fire, not since Lord Thomas Blackwood's name became something whispered behind closed doors, not since Duke Adrian Blackwood returned from war with a scar along his face and silence where laughter had once lived. The courtyard stretched wide before the manor, its stones dusted with snow, its iron braziers breathing thin columns of smoke into the cold air. Ladies in fur-trimmed cloaks stood beneath the awning. Gentlemen adjusted their gloves and pretended not to stare at the Duke, who stood apart from them all in a black riding coat, his tall figure still as the stone hawks carved above the entrance. He wore no mask over the ruined side of his face. That, Clara Whitmore thought, was its own kind of warning. She had seen men hide shame behind velvet, vanity behind gold, cruelty behind smiles. The Duke hid nothing. He simply made the world regret looking too long. Clara should not have been there. She was only the girl who carried warm bricks to the bedchambers, polished the candlesticks after supper, and knelt by the hearths before dawn so others could wake to comfort they never noticed. Her gray wool dress was too thin for the weather, her hands reddened from lye and winter water, her name known only when something was missing or late. She had come to the courtyard because Mrs. Vale had dropped one of the leather falconry gloves near the lower steps and ordered Clara to fetch it before some guests saw household carelessness lying in the snow. No one looked at her as she crossed the edge of the gathering. No one ever did. Then Ashwing screamed. The sound cut through the courtyard like a blade of cold wind, sharp enough to still every breath. The great black falcon burst upward from the trainer's arm, wings beating hard, eyes bright with terror or fury, perhaps both. The trainer stumbled back. A lady gasped. Someone knocked over a silver cup. The bird circled once above the courtyard, a dark shape against the white sky, then swept low enough to send powdered snow spinning from the stones. "Stand back," the trainer shouted, though his own voice shook. "Do not reach for him." But Clara had already bent to lift the fallen glove. She froze with it in her hands as the falcon turned toward her. Around her, the crowd retreated in a rustle of silk, boots, and fear. Clara heard Lady Evelyn Marlowe whisper, "That stupid servant girl will ruin everything." She heard another voice say, "Move, child." She could not. Ashwing came down fast, wings wide, talons curved, all storm and shadow. For one breath, Clara saw nothing but the fierce gold of his eyes. Not madness, not wickedness, fear, the kind that expects every hand to become a cage. Slowly, Clara lowered herself to one knee in the snow. She did not lift the glove like a command. She laid it across her palm like an offering. Her other hand remained open, empty, harmless. "No one is going to drag you down," she whispered, so softly the words were meant only for the bird and the winter air between them. Not today. The courtyard held its breath. Ashwing hovered once, twice, wings thundering close enough to stir the loose strands of hair at Clara's cheek. Then, before all the titled eyes of Northumberland and before the silent Duke who trusted nothing gentle, the untamable falcon folded his wings and settled upon the servant girl's arm. He did not strike. He did not flee. He lowered his proud head as if he had been waiting for her all along. Only then did Clara look up. Across the snow-bright courtyard, Duke Adrian Blackwood was staring at her, not as one looked at a servant, nor as one looked at an accident, but as if the locked door of his life had just opened by an inch. The silence after Ashwing landed was stranger than any scream. It spread across the courtyard in a pale, breathless wave, touching every face, every jeweled glove, every polished boot planted safely away from the servant girl kneeling in the snow. Clara Whitmore did not move. She felt the weight of the falcon through the leather glove, firm and living, his talons settled with careful strength upon her wrist. He was heavier than she expected, warm beneath the black gloss of his feathers, his small heart beating fast enough for her to feel it through the hide. "Do not startle him," the trainer whispered, though no one needed the warning. Even the horses at the far rail seemed to stand quieter beneath the gray afternoon sky. Clara kept her gaze lowered, not because she was ashamed, but because she understood something the others did not. Proud creatures did not like to be watched while they decided whether to trust. Across the courtyard, Duke Adrian Blackwood took one step forward. The sound of his boot against the frozen stone carried farther than it should have. Ashwing turned his head at once, golden eyes fixing on him. The Duke stopped. The whole manor seemed to stop with him. Adrian had commanded battalions, estates, tenants, judges, and men twice his age who bowed because the Blackwood name still had iron in it. Yet now he stood several yards away from a servant girl and a falcon, and for the first time in years, command had no use to him. "Miss Whitmore," Mrs. Vale said sharply from near the steps, recovering before anyone else could. "You will lower your arm at once and allow Master Redding to take the bird." Clara did not answer. She knew better than to correct a housekeeper in front of guests. She also knew better than to hand a frightened creature to a trembling man. Master Redding extended his padded arm, face pale beneath his cap. Ashwing's wings lifted slightly, not in flight, but in warning. Clara felt the shift before anyone saw it. "Please," she said softly, still looking at the bird. "Not so quickly." Lady Evelyn Marlowe gave a delicate laugh, the kind meant to sound amused and wound at the same time. "How touching. The little ash maid thinks herself a falconer." A few guests smiled because it was easier to follow cruelty than silence. Clara's cheek warmed, but her hand remained steady. The Duke looked at Lady Evelyn then, and her smile faded as though a candle had been pinched between two fingers. "Enough," he said. "Only one word. Cold. Final." The courtyard obeyed. Adrian crossed the snow at last, slowly this time, his dark coat moving in the wind, the scar along his face pale against the severe line of his jaw. Clara sensed rather than saw him stop near her. He was close enough that she could hear the controlled rhythm of his breathing, close enough to smell winter air, leather, and the faint smoke clinging to his coat. "Look at me," he said. For a moment Clara thought he spoke to the falcon. Then she realized he meant her. She lifted her eyes. Servants were trained not to meet a nobleman's gaze too directly, but surprise stole caution from her. Duke Adrian's eyes were not cruel. They were tired. Deeply, dangerously tired, as if sleep had become a room he could no longer enter. "How did you do that?" he asked. Clara swallowed. Behind him, every noble guest leaned toward the answer. "I did not do anything, Your Grace." His expression hardened with disbelief. "Ashwing has refused 3 trainers in as many years." "Then perhaps he is weary of being refused first." The words left her before she could bury them. Mrs. Vale made a small sound of horror. Lady Evelyn's lips parted. Master Redding stared at Clara as if she had dropped a candle into dry hay. Adrian did not move. Something passed across his face, too quick to name and too old to be anger. "You believe the bird was afraid." "I believe he expected every hand to take something from him." The Duke's gaze did not leave hers. The wind lifted a loose strand of Clara's hair against her cheek, and she wished suddenly that she had pinned it properly, wished her cuffs were not damp, wished she were not kneeling in the snow before people who would remember this moment only long enough to punish her for it. Then Ashwing lowered his head and touched his beak to the edge of her sleeve. A murmur moved through the courtyard. Adrian heard it. Clara saw his mouth tighten, not with embarrassment, with recognition. "Master Redding," he said without turning. "The falconry yard is closed to guests for the remainder of the day." "Your Grace." "Now." The trainer bowed at once. The guests began to scatter in reluctant clusters, carrying their disappointment like spilled wine. Lady Evelyn lingered longest, her eyes resting on Clara with a brightness that had nothing to do with curiosity. Adrian waited until the courtyard had nearly emptied before speaking again. "Miss Whitmore." "Yes, Your Grace." "From this evening forward, you will report to the falconry yard at dawn." Clara's breath caught. "Your Grace, I am assigned to the lower hearths." "You are reassigned." Mrs. Vale stepped forward. "Your Grace, with respect, the girl has no training." Adrian looked at Ashwing, calm and watchful on Clara's arm. Neither, it seems, did anyone else. Then he turned away toward the manor, leaving Clara in the snow with the impossible weight of the falcon and the even heavier weight of every eye that now noticed her. Before dawn, Blackwood Manor belonged to the cold. The grand staircases, the portraits, the silver-framed mirrors, even the velvet ropes outside the closed ballroom seemed to hold their breath beneath the blue-gray light that slipped through the tall windows. Clara Whitmore moved through the lower corridor with a lantern in one hand and her shawl pulled close around her shoulders, listening to the quiet groan of pipes behind the walls and the distant call of crows beyond the frozen gardens. She had slept little. Mrs. Vale had given her new orders with a mouth pressed thin enough to cut thread, and the other maids had watched her as if she had stolen something larger than a task. Perhaps she had. In a house built on rank, being noticed could be a kind of theft. The falconry yard stood beyond the east wing, half enclosed by a stone wall and an iron gate crusted with frost. Clara had never entered it before. Servants passed near it only when sweeping the outer walk, and even then, they moved quickly, for Ashwing's cries had a way of making the bravest footman remember unfinished duties elsewhere. She found Master Redding already there, his cap pulled low, his face stiff with the bitterness of a man forced to teach someone he wished would fail. "You will stand there," he said, pointing to a patch of trampled snow near the mews. "You will touch nothing unless I say. You will speak only when spoken to. And if the bird turns on you, do not expect me to lose a finger saving a kitchen girl who thinks kindness is a trade." Clara nodded. "Yes, sir." She did not tell him she had never claimed kindness was a trade. It was only a language, and most people shouted too loudly to hear it. Ashwing sat on his perch beneath the sloped roof, black feathers sleek against the dim lantern light, his head tucked slightly, one golden eye open. He watched Clara enter. He watched Master Redding. He watched the leather straps, the hooks, the closed doors. Clara saw it then, not merely wildness, but memory. Every time Master Redding lifted his arm too quickly, Ashwing's body tightened. Every time a latch clicked, the bird's wings shifted. Fear did not always tremble. Sometimes it stood very still and waited to strike the world before the world could strike first. "He takes meat from the left tray," Master Redding said. "Never from the hand. He hates hands." Clara looked at the bird, then at her own fingers, roughened by soap and cold dust. "Perhaps he hates what hands have done." The trainer scoffed, but before he could answer, the iron gate opened behind them. Duke Adrian Blackwood stepped into the yard without announcement. He wore no hat despite the cold, and the pale morning touched the scar along his face with a softness that made it seem less like ruin and more like a map of something survived. Master Redding bowed at once. Clara lowered her eyes, but not before she saw the Duke studying the falcon, not her. That should have relieved her. It did not. "Proceed," Adrian said. Master Redding placed a small piece of meat on the end of a short rod and moved toward the perch. Ashwing shrank back, feathers lifting. The trainer stopped, annoyed. "He is being difficult because of the company." Clara felt the Duke's gaze shift toward her. She did not defend herself. Instead, she set her lantern down, took one slow step away from the men, and began to hum under her breath. It was not a pretty song. It was old, plain, and low, the kind her father used to hum while mending his boots by the stove after returning from militia drills in the northern counties. Clara had forgotten some of the words, but not the shape of the melody. It rose and fell like walking through snow toward a lighted window. Ashwing's head lifted. Master Redding froze. The Duke did, too. Clara kept humming, softer now, letting the notes rest in the air rather than push forward. The falcon stepped once along the perch. Then again, his wings loosened. His fierce eye fixed on Clara, but not with alarm. With recognition. Behind her, Adrian's voice came very quietly. "Where did you learn that tune?" Clara turned, startled by something in his tone. Not command this time. Not suspicion. Pain, carefully locked, and suddenly struck from within. "From my father, your grace." His name, Samuel Whitmore. The yard seemed to grow colder. Adrian looked toward Ashwing, but his face had gone distant, as if he were seeing another morning, another field, another sky. "Your father served in the Northern Regiment." Clara's fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. "Yes, your grace." He did not speak of it often. "No," Adrian said, almost to himself. The good men rarely did. Ashwing stepped down from the perch to the lower rail, closer than he had ever come from Master Redding. Clara slowly extended her bare hand, palm open, not offering food, not demanding obedience. The bird watched. The Duke watched. And in that thin blue hour before the household woke, the falcon bent his proud head toward the servant girl's empty hand, while Adrian Blackwood stood motionless behind her, hearing a dead soldier's song return through the voice of a woman no one had thought worth hearing. By the time the breakfast bells rang through Blackwood Manor, Clara Whitmore's name had traveled farther than she ever had. It moved through the laundry room in sharp whispers, crossed the servants' hall between bowls of porridge and cups of weak tea, climbed the back stairs faster than any maid carrying linen, and reached the drawing rooms by noon dressed in silk, suspicion, and polite cruelty. A servant girl had been reassigned by the Duke himself. A servant girl had entered the falconry yard before sunrise. A servant girl had made Ashwing lower his head as though she carried some invisible title in her open palm. Clara heard pieces of it while carrying a basket of folded towels past the pantry. She must have bewitched the creature, one maid murmured. No bird that proud chooses hands like hers. Another replied, perhaps the Duke likes strange things now. They say grief changes a man. Clara kept walking. Words had followed her all her life, small and cold as sleet, and she had learned that stopping to answer them only gave them a chair by the fire. Yet there was a difference between being unseen and being watched with resentment. By afternoon, even the corridors felt altered. Footmen paused when she passed. The scullery boy stared openly until Mrs. Vale snapped his name. The housekeeper's own displeasure was quieter and therefore worse. You will remember, Mrs. Vale said while inspecting the silver in the service room, that a temporary instruction from His Grace does not make you special. Falcon feathers do not turn Ash girls into ladies. Clara lowered her eyes. Yes, Mrs. Vale. And you will not speak of what occurs in that yard. No, Mrs. Vale. Nor imagine that kindness to an animal is equal to breeding. Clara's hands stilled around the polishing cloth for less than a breath. Then she resumed her work until the spoon in her fingers shone with a clear, obedient light. Near 4 o'clock, a carriage arrived from Marlowe House, its wheels cutting dark tracks through the melting snow. Lady Evelyn Marlowe entered as though Blackwood Manor had been built to receive her shadow. She wore a winter gown the color of cream, a fox-lined cloak, and a smile so delicate it made every servant straighten in fear of damaging it. Clara had just crossed the great hall with a tray of fresh candles when Lady Evelyn saw her. Ah, the lady said, pausing beneath the chandelier. There she is. Mr. Hargrove, the steward, stood at Lady Evelyn's side, his narrow face calm, his silver watch chain resting against his waistcoat like a badge of patience. He had served the Blackwood family for more than 20 years and carried authority with the smoothness of a locked drawer. Miss Whitmore, he said, her ladyship is speaking to you. Clara stopped and curtsied carefully, steadying the tray. My lady. Lady Evelyn's gaze moved over Clara's plain dress, her reddened hands, the small loose curl that had escaped beneath her cap. So this is the girl who has unsettled the household. I expected someone taller. Mr. Hargrove's mouth barely moved, but satisfaction touched his eyes. Clara said nothing. Lady Evelyn stepped closer, her perfume sweet and cold, like flowers kept too long in a room without sunlight. Tell me, child, what did you promise the bird? Scraps from the kitchen? Little songs? Or did it simply mistake you for something wild enough to pity? A footman at the far wall looked down quickly. Clara felt the heat rise beneath her skin, but her voice remained soft. I promised him nothing, my lady. How convenient. The lowest people often claim innocence when they have no explanation. At that moment, from somewhere beyond the eastern corridor, Ashwing cried out. The sound echoed through the hall, clear and piercing. Clara turned before she could stop herself. Lady Evelyn noticed. So did Mr. Hargrove. His expression tightened by a measure too small for most eyes. But Clara had spent years reading danger in rooms where she was expected to be silent. You see, Lady Evelyn said lightly. It calls, and she answers. How charming. How improper. The falcon may be unsettled, Clara said. May I go to the yard? Lady Evelyn laughed. She asks permission as though she belongs anywhere near it. Mr. Hargrove stepped between Clara and the corridor. The falconry yard is not a theater for servant girls seeking admiration. Clara looked at him then, truly looked, and saw something beneath his composure. Not annoyance. Fear. Before she could understand it, Lady Evelyn drew a lace handkerchief from her sleeve, embroidered with the Marlowe crest in pale blue thread. She brushed it once against Clara's tray as if wiping away dust, then let it fall deliberately near Clara's shoes. Pick it up, she said. The hall went still. Clara bent slowly, candles trembling on the tray. But before her fingers reached the handkerchief, Ashwing swept in through the open arch of the eastern passage, wings beating the air into startled motion. He landed on the lowest rail of the grand staircase and fixed his golden eyes not on Clara, but on Lady Evelyn's fallen handkerchief. Then the falcon tore the delicate lace free from the crest with one sharp pull and flung it onto the stone floor. Lady Evelyn went pale. Mr. Hargrove did not. He looked toward the eastern passage, toward the yard, toward secrets Clara did not yet know had begun to stir. And from the upper landing, unseen until that moment, Duke Adrian Blackwood watched every face in the hall as if Ashwing had not ruined a lady's handkerchief, but pointed to the first crack in a lie. After the incident in the Great Hall, Blackwood Manor did not return to its former silence. It pretended to. The servants resumed their duties, the guests lowered their voices, and Lady Evelyn Marlowe retired to the blue drawing room with a handkerchief too ruined to be repaired and pride too wounded to be displayed in public. Yet something had changed beneath the polished floors and behind the paneled walls. Clara felt it as she carried fresh water to the east wing that evening. Felt it in the way people stopped speaking a moment before she entered, in the way Mr. Hargrove watched her from the end of corridors, in the way Ashwing cried once from the falconry yard whenever she passed the windows facing the stables. Near sunset, Clara went to the abandoned greenhouse to rinse a small scratch along her wrist where the falcon's talon had pressed through the glove that morning. It was not a serious mark, only a thin red line, but Mrs. Vale would ask questions if she saw it, and questions in Blackwood Manor had a way of becoming accusations before supper. The greenhouse stood beyond the frozen rose garden, its glass panes clouded with frost, its iron ribs dark against the fading sky. Once, it must have held orange trees, climbing vines, and flowers too delicate for northern winters. Now only a few stubborn ferns survived in cracked pots, and the long tables smelled of cold earth, old water, and neglect. Clara set her lantern on a stone ledge and unwrapped the cloth from her wrist. "You should have told someone." The voice came from the doorway. Clara startled, then turned so quickly the lantern flame bent. Duke Adrian Blackwood stood beneath the iron arch, one shoulder shadowed, the scarred side of his face half silvered by the dying light. He did not enter at once. That restraint unsettled her more than command would have. "It is nothing, Your Grace," she said. Nothing is the word servants use when they have been taught that pain inconveniences others. Clara looked down at her wrist. And what word do dukes use? For a breath, she regretted it. The old rules rose in her throat, warning her to lower her eyes, apologize, become small again. But Adrian did not rebuke her. He stepped inside, his boots quiet on the damp stone floor. "Duty," he said. The answer was so plain and so tired that Clara forgot to be afraid. He set a small tin of salve on the table between them. "Mrs. Bell keeps this for the stable hands. It prevents swelling." Clara reached for it, but the lid was stiff. Before she could struggle long enough to embarrass herself, Adrian took the tin and opened it with a brief turn of his hand. He did not touch her. He only placed it back within reach. That, too, felt like an understanding. "Ashwing did not mean to hurt me," she said. "You defend him quickly." "No. I explain him carefully." Adrian's gaze moved to her wrist, then to the frost-blurred panes above them. Outside, the last light gathered along the snow like pale ash. Most people do not make that distinction. Clara dabbed the salve over the mark. Most people are in a hurry to decide what something is. Dangerous, useless, lowborn, ruined. The final word entered the air too softly, but it reached him. She saw it in the stillness of his mouth, in the slight turn of his face away from the lantern. For the first time, Clara understood that the Duke's scar was not the only wound people had stared at until it became armor. "You speak as if you know much about being judged," he said. Clara smiled faintly, without humor. "I am a servant, Your Grace. People decide what I am before I enter the room. And what are you?" The question should have been simple. It was not. No one had asked it as though the answer mattered. Clara closed the tin carefully. "I am someone who listens before reaching." Adrian looked at her then. Fully. Not as a master evaluating a servant, not as a gentleman indulging a curiosity, but as a man who had heard a key turned somewhere in the dark. "That is why he trusts you." "Perhaps. And why do you not fear him?" Clara thought of Ashwing's wings beating above the courtyard, his bright eye, his proud terror. Then she thought of the Duke standing alone at the edge of his own house, watched by everyone and known by no one. Because fear is not always a warning to run, she said. Sometimes it is a plea to move slowly. The greenhouse grew very quiet. Adrian's gloved hand rested on the table, inches from the tin of salve, inches from her own hand, though neither crossed the distance. The space between them felt fragile, like ice over deep water. "Does it still hurt?" Clara asked before she could stop herself. His eyes darkened. She had not said what. She did not need to. For a long moment, only the wind answered against the glass. Then Adrian said, "Every winter." Clara nodded once, not with pity, not with shock, but with the grave acceptance one gives to truth when it has finally been allowed to stand in the room. From far beyond the garden, Ashwing called into the dusk. This time, the sound did not seem wild. It sounded almost like recognition. That night, the snow returned without warning. It came softly at first, touching the windows of Blackwood Manor like pale fingers, then thickened until the gardens vanished beneath a moving white veil and the lamps along the drive became faint, blurred stars. Clara was in the lower passage carrying a tray of cooling bricks toward the guest rooms when Ashwing cried out. The sound did not come once. It came again, sharper, closer to panic than pride. Clara stopped so abruptly that one of the bricks shifted against the tray with a dull scrape. At the far end of the corridor, Mr. Hargrove stood half in shadow near the servant's stair. He turned his head toward the eastern wing, but instead of alarm, Clara saw irritation cross his face, quick and controlled. "Continue with your work, Miss Whitmore," he said. "The bird is restless." Nothing more. Clara looked past him toward the dark windows where snow pressed itself against the glass. "He does not call that way for nothing. You have known the creature for 2 days and speak as if you were born with feathers." His voice remained calm, but the calm had edges. "Go." Clara lowered her eyes. "Yes, sir." She walked 3 steps. Then Ashwing cried again, and something inside her chose before fear could argue. She set the tray on a side table and turned down the narrow passage toward the falconry yard. Mr. Hargrove's voice followed her, colder now. "Miss Whitmore." She did not stop. By the time Clara reached the yard, the wind had opened the gate and scattered snow across the stones. The mews door swung loose on its hinge, creaking in the storm. Ashwing was gone. A black feather lay caught against the threshold, trembling as if still alive. Clara took it into her hand, and before she could call for help, a lantern flared behind her. Duke Adrian Blackwood stood at the gate, coat unfastened, hair stirred by the wind, his expression stripped of ceremony. "Where is he?" "I do not know, Your Grace." Clara pointed toward the outer wall. "But he went that way." Adrian followed the line of her hand. Beyond the wall stretched the old northern path, leading toward the frost fields and the abandoned chapel near Blackthorn Wood. The place no servant entered after dusk. The place tied to Lord Thomas's final ride. "Go inside," he said. "No." The word left Clara quietly, but it stood between them with surprising strength. Adrian turned on her. "This is not a hearth you may tend. The ground drops beyond the chapel road. In weather like this, a person can lose the path within 50 yards. Then the falcon can lose it too. He is a bird. He is afraid." Adrian's jaw tightened. For a moment, she thought he would command her back by force of title alone. Instead, Ashwing's distant cry cut through the storm, thin but unmistakable. Adrian looked toward the dark. So did Clara. Without another word, he took the lantern from the hook beside the gate and strode into the snow. Clara followed. The wind struck them hard beyond the shelter of the manor walls. Snow gathered on Clara's lashes and soaked the hem of her dress within minutes. But she kept her eyes fixed on the Duke's black coat ahead of her and the occasional flash of Ashwing's wings above the trees. They walked nearly a quarter-mile before the chapel appeared. A broken shape crouched among the pines, its roof half fallen, its stone cross leaning beneath the weight of winter. Ashwing perched on the archway where the doors had once stood. He did not cry now. He waited. Adrian stopped at the edge of the clearing, his face gone pale beneath the storm. Clara saw his hand close around the lantern handle until the leather creaked. "This is where they found Thomas," he said. His voice was almost lost to the wind. Clara said nothing. Some grief did not permit questions. Ashwing dropped from the arch and swept inside the ruin. Clara moved after him, stepping carefully over fallen stone. The chapel smelled of snow, damp wood, and old silence. In the far wall, Beneath a carved angel worn smooth by weather, Ashwing scratched at a gap between two stones. Not fiercely, deliberately. Clara knelt. There is something here. Adrian came beside her, holding the lantern low. The light revealed a strip of dark leather wedged deep in the crack. Clara eased it free with cold fingers. Attached to it was a small silver clasp engraved with the Blackwood crest, but beneath the crest was another mark, nearly hidden by age and dirt. A narrow letter H, Hargrove. The name seemed to form in the air before either of them spoke it. Adrian stared at the clasp as if the ruin beneath his feet had shifted. This was not Thomas's. Clara looked at Ashwing, who stood on a fallen beam with snow melting along his black wings. The Falcon had not fled into the storm. He had led them. Adrian closed his hand around the leather, and the first true crack in his long silence opened not with anger, but with grief. All these years, he whispered, he was trying to show me. By morning, the storm had passed, but the cold it left behind seemed to settle inside the walls. Blackwood Manor woke beneath a white sky, its windows glazed with frost, its chimneys breathing slowly over the silent grounds. Clara returned to her duties with damp boots, aching hands, and the memory of the silver clasp hidden now in the locked drawer of the Duke's study. No one knew where she had been except Adrian, Ashwing, and the snow-covered ruin beyond Blackthorn Wood. Yet secrets had a scent in old houses. By breakfast, Mr. Hargrove's courtesy had sharpened into something almost perfect. He bowed to the Duke with unchanged precision. He spoke to Mrs. Vale about firewood, pantry accounts, and guest arrangements as though nothing in the world had shifted beneath his feet. But when his eyes found Clara across the servants' hall, she felt the weight of them like a door closing. He knew, or worse, he feared what she knew. Lady Evelyn Marlowe remained at Blackwood Manor under the pretense of weather-delayed roads, though the main drive had been cleared before noon. She sat in the morning room with embroidery she never touched and watched the eastern windows whenever Ashwing passed overhead. Clara saw her once from the corridor, pale and composed beside the tea service, speaking quietly with Mr. Hargrove while the other guests turned pages and warmed their hands near the fire. The steward's face gave nothing away. Lady Evelyn's did. Anger looked different on beautiful people. It tried to disguise itself as dignity, but it still tightened the mouth. Near midday, Mrs. Vale sent Clara to the linen closet beside the west gallery for fresh sheets. The errand was ordinary. That was what made it dangerous. The west gallery was rarely used in winter, and the air there smelled of old polish and closed rooms. Clara had just lifted a stack of folded linen when she heard footsteps behind her. Mr. Hargrove stood in the doorway. "You have been greatly favored for a girl in your position," he said. Clara held the sheets against her chest. "I only do what His Grace commands. His Grace is not always wise in his grief. That is not for me to judge." "No," Hargrove said softly. "It is not." He stepped aside, and Lady Evelyn entered. In daylight, without guests around her, her beauty seemed harder, all pearl and winter glass. She carried a small velvet case in one hand. "Such a pity," she said, looking at the shelves rather than Clara. "When people rise too quickly, they often forget where their hands belong." Clara's throat tightened. "My lady, I should return to my work." "Indeed you should." Lady Evelyn opened the velvet case. Inside lay a pearl brooch shaped like a spray of hawthorn blossoms, delicate and unmistakably valuable. Clara had seen it once pinned at Lady Evelyn's collar. The lady set it on the linen shelf. Clara went still. "Please do not do this." Lady Evelyn smiled faintly. "Do what?" Hargrove's voice was gentle. "Careful, Miss Whitmore. Accusations against your betters can ruin a life far faster than theft." Clara looked from one face to the other and understood with a terrible calm that the trap did not need to be clever. It only needed to be believed. Within the hour, the great hall filled with witnesses. The brooch had been discovered in the linen closet. Clara had been the last servant sent there. Lady Evelyn stood near the hearth with one hand pressed to her throat, performing distress with exquisite restraint. Mrs. Vale looked stricken. The maids stared at Clara as if distance might protect them. Mr. Hargrove held the velvet case and spoke with solemn regret. "I take no pleasure in this, Your Grace. But the item was found where Miss Whitmore had no reason to conceal it unless she feared discovery." Clara stood in the center of the hall in her plain gray dress, the same hall where Ashwing had torn Lady Evelyn's handkerchief the day before. Her hands were folded before her. She did not cry. She did not beg. To beg would suggest mercy was owed to her. In houses like this, mercy was given only when it cost nothing. Adrian stood on the lower stair, his face unreadable, the scar along his cheek pale in the winter light. Clara looked at him once. Only once. Something in her chest gave way when he said nothing. Lady Evelyn lowered her voice. Surely, Your Grace, you see now what comes of allowing a servant girl beyond her station. The words moved through the hall like smoke. Clara waited for Adrian to speak. He did not. Mr. Hargrove closed the velvet case with a soft click that sounded final. For the dignity of the household, she should be dismissed before nightfall. Clara bowed her head, not in guilt, in exhaustion. She had been unseen all her life, and now, at last, she was visible only as something to be removed. Then, far above them, from the shadowed beams beneath the vaulted ceiling, came the sharp beat of wings. The sound did not belong to accusation. It belonged to judgment. Ashwing dropped from the high beams in a rush of black wings, sweeping low over the gathered household until candles trembled in their silver holders and every face lifted in alarm. He did not fly toward Clara. He did not fly toward the brooch. He circled once above the great hall, then landed on the carved newel post beside Duke Adrian Blackwood, his talons settling with deliberate care. In his beak, he held a small object that flashed dull silver beneath the winter light. Mr. Hargrove's face changed so quickly that only Clara, watching from the center of the hall, saw the mask slip. Lady Evelyn saw it too, and her hand tightened around the back of a chair. Adrian raised his gloved hand. Ashwing stepped onto it, proud and calm, then opened his beak. The object fell into the Duke's palm. A silver button, not grand enough for a nobleman's coat, not plain enough for a servant's livery. It bore the faint engraved edge of the Blackwood household crest, the kind worn only by the steward on formal occasions. A thread of dark leather clung to its rim, weathered and old, matching the strip found in the ruined chapel. The hall seemed to shrink around the sound of everyone breathing. Adrian looked at the button for a long moment. Then he lifted his eyes to Mr. Hargrove. "How curious," he said quietly. "Ashwing has brought me the second piece of a story you assured me ended years ago." Hargrove bowed his head just enough to seem respectful. "Your Grace, I cannot imagine what that bird has found, but surely it has no bearing on this regrettable matter." "No bearing." Adrian descended one step. "Last night, Miss Whitmore and I followed Ashwing to the old chapel." A murmur passed through the hall. Lady Evelyn went still. "There, he uncovered a leather clasp marked with your initial. This morning, before I could question you, Miss Whitmore was conveniently accused of theft." Hargrove's lips thinned. A servant girl's word should not outweigh years of loyal service. Clara felt the words strike the room exactly where he intended. Rank against truth. Silk against wool. A locked door against an open hand. But Adrian did not look at her as a witness to be defended. He looked at her as someone already believed. "It is not her word," he said. "It is yours." He turned to Mrs. Vale. "Bring the household ledger from the steward's office. The private one." For the first time, Hargrove stepped back. "Your Grace, those accounts are not prepared for review. Then they will be honest." No one moved until Mrs. Vale hurried from the hall. Lady Evelyn's voice entered the silence, smooth but strained. "Adrian, grief has made you vulnerable to strange influences. You are allowing a bird and a servant girl to guide your judgment." Adrian turned toward her. "Do not use my name to soften a lie." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Lady Evelyn's color faded. Mrs. Vale returned with a narrow black ledger. Adrian opened it on the hall table, turned several pages, and stopped. His face became colder than the snow beyond the windows. "Payments to Marlowe House. Repeated for 6 years." Hargrove said nothing. Lady Evelyn whispered, "That is not what it seems." "Then tell me what it is." No answer came. Adrian placed the silver button beside the ledger, then reached into his coat and withdrew the leather clasp from the chapel. The two pieces lay together like fragments of a door finally unlocked. "My brother did not ride alone that night," Adrian said. His voice lowered, but every person heard him. Someone led him to the chapel. Someone concealed what Ashwing saw. Someone kept the Falcon locked away afterward because he remembered too much. Hargrove's composure broke not with a shout, but with a sagging of the shoulders, as though 20 years of borrowed dignity had become too heavy to carry. Lady Evelyn looked away first, and that was confession enough for the room. Clara stood very still, hardly daring to breathe. Her innocence had not been pleaded. It had been revealed. The brooch in the velvet case suddenly looked small, almost foolish, beside the truth it had tried to bury. Adrian closed the ledger. "Mr. Hargrove, you will remain in the library until the magistrate arrives. Lady Evelyn, your carriage will be prepared. You will not return to this house." Lady Evelyn's eyes flashed. "You would cast me out for her?" She pointed at Clara as if the gesture could return the world to its proper order. "For truth," Adrian said, "and because she stood with more honor in a servant's dress than you ever managed in silk." The hall fell into a silence so complete it seemed even the fire paused to listen. Then Adrian crossed the stone floor to Clara. She expected a command, perhaps a formal apology, something distant enough to preserve the boundary between them. Instead, he removed his dark wool cloak and placed it around her shoulders before the entire household. It was warm from him, heavy with winter air and cedar smoke. Clara looked up, startled, and found his eyes steady on hers. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "you were never beneath notice. We were beneath the grace to see you." Ashwing gave one soft cry from the stair rail, and this time no one in Blackwood Manor mistook it for wildness. In the days that followed, Blackwood Manor did not become a joyful place all at once. Old houses did not heal like candle flames catching on dry wick. They healed like winter fields, slowly, beneath a surface that still looked cold to anyone passing by. The magistrate came from town in a closed carriage, and Mr. Hargrove left through the side entrance before dusk, no longer wearing the silver watch chain that had once announced his authority in every corridor. Lady Evelyn departed before him, her trunks packed in silence, her name spoken afterward only in careful fragments. The truth of Lord Thomas Blackwood's final night unfolded through ledgers, letters, and the small, stubborn memories of a Falcon no one had thought capable of bearing witness. There were no grand celebrations. Adrian did not order music. He did not reopen the ballroom. But on the morning after the last guest left, the black mourning veil was removed from the portrait in the entrance hall. Clara saw it while carrying fresh linen past the staircase. Lord Thomas had been young, fair-haired, and smiling in the painted light, one hand resting near a falcon's perch. Beneath the portrait, someone had placed a single white rose in a glass vase. Adrian stood before it alone. Clara should have turned away. Instead, she remained at the edge of the hall, quiet as snowfall. "He was younger than I remember," Adrian said without looking back. Clara held the linen basket against her waist. "Grief keeps people at the age we lost them." He turned then, and something in his face had changed. The scar was still there. The grief was still there. But neither seemed to rule him so completely. "Your father said something like that once." Clara's breath caught. "You knew him well." "Well enough to know he mended his own boots badly and sang off-key when he was tired." A small smile touched Clara before she could stop it. He did both with confidence. Adrian looked at her as if that smile had opened a window in a room long sealed. "He was a good man. I know. He believed I could be one." The words were so low that they seemed meant for the stone floor, the portrait, the dead, and Clara only because she had not walked away. She set the basket down. Perhaps he was right. Outside, Ashwing cried from the falconry yard, not sharply now, but with a clear note that carried over the thawing grounds. Winter sunlight spread thinly across the marble floor. Adrian drew a breath, then offered his arm, not as a duke commanding a servant, but as a man asking someone to walk beside him. Clara hesitated only a moment before placing her hand lightly upon his sleeve. They went out together into the morning. The yard smelled of clean snow, hay, leather, and smoke from the stable chimneys. Master Redding stood near the mews, careful and subdued, but he bowed to Clara with a respect that would have been impossible a week before. Ashwing waited on the high perch, black wings glossy beneath the pale sun. When Clara approached, he did not need to be called. He came to her at once, landing with familiar weight upon the glove she now wore. Not the old training glove from the yard, but a finer one, dark leather lined in soft wool, embroidered at the cuff with the Blackwood crest. Clara looked down at it, startled. "Your Grace, this is not mine." Adrian stood beside her, the wind lifting the edge of his coat. "It was my mother's." Clara went still. She knew enough of noble houses to understand such things were not given lightly. Then I cannot keep it. You can. People will talk. They already have. They will say I forgot my place. Adrian looked across the yard, where Ashwing opened his wings to the sky and held them there, free yet willing to remain. Then they misunderstand place. It is not always where one is born. Sometimes it is where one is finally seen. Clara's eyes lowered to the falcon. Her throat tightened, but she would not weep in the cold. She had spent too many years saving tears for pillows and darkness. Adrian turned toward her, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear. I spent years believing power meant keeping every wounded thing under control. The bird, the house, my grief, myself. He paused, watching Ashwing settle between them. Then you taught me that trust cannot be ordered. It must be invited. Clara looked at him then, not at the Duke, not at the scar, not at the title that stood between them like an old iron gate, but at the man who had finally begun to open it. And you taught me, she said, that even locked houses can let in light. He did not reach for her hand. Not yet. Their story had moved too slowly, too carefully, through pain to deserve haste. But as Ashwing lifted from Clara's glove and rose into the bright winter air, circling once above Blackwood Manor before returning willingly, Clara understood what the whole house would one day learn. No heart is ever truly wild. Some are only waiting for a hand gentle enough not to cage them.